I'm going to read from Luke chapter 7, verse 11 through 17. And it's Jesus raises the widow's son of Nain. Soon afterward, Jesus went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went along with him. As he approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the town was with her. When the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her, and he said, "Don't cry." Then he went up to and touched the bier they were carrying him on, and the bearers stood still. He said, "Young man, I say to you, get up." The dead man sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. They were all filled with awe and praised God. "A great prophet has appeared among us," they said. "God has come to help his people." This news about Jesus spread throughout Judea and the surrounding country.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you so much. Well, Liz is also a wonderful mother, so let's give a hand for Liz, if that's all right. I think it's important to acknowledge our moms because they sure put up with a lot. You know, at least my mom did. At least, you know, both of my parents, me and my brothers, my siblings, we're all pretty rowdy. And you don't know this about me. I've been struck by an automobile on 2 separate occasions. I fell out of countless trees. I ran through a plate glass window one time. You know, all of us were just so rowdy. In fact, my brothers were wild too. And on one occasion, one of my brothers got his birthday taken away because they were playing hide and go seek on the roof. And we had so many broken bones. My mom always loves to tell this story that our orthopedic doctor knew all of us by first name. That's how many broken bones we had. We were just rowdy kids. And you know, kids can do kind of crazy things. And May, in addition to being Mother's Day, is also May the 4th. Anybody know that nice little pun? May the 4th be with you. It's you know, Star Wars time. Well, I have a Star Wars story that's combined with a mom story. And that's that when I was about 10 years old, about my son's age, I woke up like at the crack of dawn, and I sat in front of the mirror meticulously for a very long time and painted my face like Darth Maul from Star Wars Episode 1, okay? Then I snuck into my mom's bedroom and woke her up like that. That was just a great son move right there. But, you know, our mothers, they put up with a lot. And I've heard it said that, you know, when a mother brings a baby into the world, it's like a piece of her heart. And that wherever that kid goes, you know, it's like a piece of your mom's heart is just like out there in the world. So I'm going to be a good pastor, and I'm going to say, call your mom. Call your mom, all right? You know, better yet, if you have the availability to, if she's not, you know, 1,000 miles away, go see her in person. Like, go visit your mom. And on the topic of doing things in person, we are in a series called IRL. IRL. If you are a mom and you're a boomer and you don't know what IRL means, just kidding. It means in real life. I'm teasing, but it means in real life. And the concept is this: you know, maybe you're having Zoom meetings with a coworker and they live on the other side of the world, or you're just interacting with somebody on social media, or you're on one of these dating apps. Well, then the day comes where you go IRL, where it's not just simply internet, and you meet face to face, and you know, sometimes the person's way different than you expected. Oh my gosh, they're bigger, they're shorter than you thought. You know, their profile said they were 6'1", but they're actually 5'10". You know, like you go IRL, and sometimes it can be a big surprise. And the premise of the series is this: the audacious claim, the staggering claim of the Gospels and of the apostles is that Jesus is the Hebrew God, the God of the Old Testament, the God of heaven and earth, the maker of heaven and earth. He is God IRL. That throughout the Old Testament, you know, they'd heard a voice. They'd maybe heard a voice at Sinai, or they had these, you know, visions. But then God shows up. Boom! He becomes a human being. He has a human mother. He's in the flesh, and there he is, IRL. And so we're looking at 10 encounters with Jesus in the Gospels, and And so we're examining these 10 different encounters where Jesus comes face to face with individuals. And I'm inviting you just to examine this, to examine, maybe you have certain ideas about God. Maybe you have certain expectations about God. Maybe you think there is no God. Or maybe you think if there is a God, maybe he's detached or indifferent or harsh or angry or capricious. But in the face of Jesus, I think some of your expectations are going to be overturned if you stick with us for this 10-part series. Now, in the text that Liz just read, Jesus has just come from healing a Roman centurion's son. Now, a Roman centurion in Israel would be a racial outsider. He'd be a racial outcast. And he'd be an outcast also in part because the Romans were their oppressors, but he'd also be an outcast just because the rabbis, they wanted nothing to do with Gentiles. They thought they were dogs. They thought they were unclean. They were filthy. But here Jesus is, and he interacts with this Roman centurion, and he says, hey, actually, this guy you think is a dog, you think that he's a filthy Gentile, he actually has more faith than anyone in Israel. And he heals this Roman centurion's servant. And then coming right out of this, he's now approaching a village called Nain. Okay, Nain, if you ever go to Israel, Palestine, if you ever go to that part of the world, down from the Sea of Galilee, about a day's journey from Galilee, about 6 miles from Nazareth, where Jesus grew up, there's this tiny, tiny, insignificant little village called Nain. And what we're seeing in both of these stories is that Jesus always cares for the things that are out on the margins. Whether it's someone racially, someone who's not a part of the chosen people, right? Or it's a tiny little insignificant village, and a woman who's a widow, a woman who has now lost her son, so she's absolutely destitute. In that culture, to be a widow, you had very few prospects. I mean, you needed someone to marry you. To lose your son, that's any hope that she had of being taken care of. Now it's been eliminated. And that's where Jesus is looking. He's looking to the vulnerable. He's looking to the outcast. He's looking to the small, little, insignificant village. And these are the people that Jesus cares for. And maybe you feel like you've been on the margins. Maybe you feel at different points in your life you felt excluded or you felt insignificant. Well, those are the precise kinds of people that Jesus gave supreme attention to. I mean, you got to picture the scene, because in our culture, in funerals, everybody stays pretty quiet. I mean, people, they put their sunglasses on. They don't want to be seen crying. They keep it very subdued, very mellow. Everything's it's silent at funerals. But it wasn't that way in their culture, and it isn't that way in a lot of cultures around the world. They actually would have wailing and weeping, and Luke says that there are 2 large crowds coming. There's Jesus coming in a large crowd, and it's full of excitement and jubilation, and just like, we can't even believe this guy. Do you see the way he healed that centurion's servant? This is astonishing, astounding. Then you have another crowd that's coming out, and they're carrying in a wicker basket. They didn't have coffins like ours. They would have been carrying him in this large wicker container. And they're weeping, and they're wailing, and they're mourning, and they're devastated. So picture the sorrow, the grief, just the absolute despondency on this side. Then on the other side, you see the joy, the expectation, the jubilation. Here you have a son who's dead. Here you have a son of life. And these 2 crowds are going to collide, and triumph and victory, it swallows up grief and tragedy. So that's where we're going. So the title of my message, very simple, is just Jesus and a grieving mom. And the first thought we're going to look at from this passage is that death is more tragic than we admit. Death is more tragic than we admit. Now, talking about death on Mother's Day, you may feel like, man, this pastor, you need to get an idea. Geez, get a little bit of a clue here. But I would like to defend myself. I'd like to say, I think actually it's very appropriate to just contend with the realities of death. Want to know why? Because I think it's important that we don't take our loved ones for granted. I think it's important that we don't let grievances and conflicts and things get in the way. that we realize that life is short, that we realize that relationships are really the thing that make life matter, and that we should cherish our mothers. Some of us maybe have difficult relationships with our mothers, but I think that's all the more reason why we should, still seek to reach out, seek to show grace, seek to show forgiveness, seek reconciliation, not let the years and years go by and then a tragedy happens and, in one way or the other. I mean, in this instance, it's kind of the reversal of the natural order, right? The mom is burying the son. And for many of us, we're going to one day bury our parents, but either way you slice it, we should value those relationships. We should make the most of the time that we have, and we should seek to love our parents. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean there's sometimes a need for boundaries, but I actually heard it said that a boundary is a desire to have someone in your life, not the desire to have someone out of your life. That sometimes you have to draw boundaries because you want the person in your life and you want to stay sane, and you want to be able to keep the relationship going without it detonating in some destructive way. So you might not have expected death on a Mother's Day sermon. You might not have expected that. You probably also didn't expect to think so much about death last year when you saw the Barbie movie. Anybody notice that? Like how dark and fascinating and hilarious and existential that movie was. It was really interesting. I actually came upon an interview with the director, Greta Gerwig. Greta Gerwig said this. The interviewer asked her, "Do you ever think about dying?" "Oh my gosh, all the time. No, I really do. Of the many things I've made in my life, Margot dancing at a dance party as Barbie, asking everybody, do you guys ever think about dying?" You remember that part of the movie? They're at the huge dance party and the music stops. She's like, "I'm dying to dance." But do you guys ever think about dying? Is pretty much the nearest I've felt seen in my own work. It's moving and also strange. We go to a dance party and we worry that we're alone, and then we find each other in the worry and we try to make meaning. I don't know what else we can do. I appreciate her honesty. She's at least going, death is looming. There's this dread. There's this angst, that just hangs over me. Now, there are some people in our culture, many people in the city of Portland, you'd talk to them, and they would say something along the lines of, no, death is nothing to be afraid of. Death is natural. Death, it's just a part of the cycle of life. But with all due respect, I want to say, I don't buy it. I don't buy it. And I'm obviously sharing this message. I mean, I chose this mainly because we're in this 10 encounters with Jesus, and this is one encounter with a mother. But I am speaking to you today as someone who just buried a parent, just buried my dad about 5 weeks ago, or actually 4 weeks ago. He passed away about 5 weeks ago. And the thing that was really hard for us was, when he got the diagnosis of pancreatic cancer this time last year, we thought that we at least had 2 years. And then we got some extremely when we were praying for 5, we were praying for 10, we were praying for much longer. Right? We wanted as much time as possible with him. But then in December, we got some absolutely gut-wrenching, horrible news that he had weeks or months to live. And then he got a second opinion, and that second opinion told us, no, hey, with the chemo, we think we could get a full another year. And then in reality, it ended only being a couple more months. And all of us, we feel so robbed by that. We go, I just wish we had one more year. But here's the thing. If I got one more year with my dad, want to know what I would want? I would want one more year. And if I got 5 more years with my dad, want to know what I would want? I would want 5 more years. I say that I don't buy it. I don't buy, death is natural. It's just part of the cycle of life. It's nothing to fear. Don't worry about it. You are really telling me you want to look someone you love in the face and say, hey, now's your time. Never going to see you again. Cease to exist. I want nothing more to do with you ever. Gone. Vaporized. Oblivion. I don't buy it. All of us want love to last forever. That's what we want more than anything. We want love to last forever. And the biblical claim is that death was not meant to be part of our story. The biblical claim is that death feels unnatural, and let me tell you, having just lost, apart from my wife and children, the person I loved more than anyone on this planet, having just lost him, let me just tell you, death feels unnatural. And the Bible says that death feels unnatural because it is unnatural. It's not meant to be part of the human story. Death is an intruder. Death is a foreign invader. Death is a thief. Death is an enemy. And the Bible says that death entered in, at least into the human story, as a component of our alienation from the God of life. That in our alienation from God, in what's called the fall or in sin, that it's a consequence of our reality, of us being separated from God. But now here comes the God of creation, the God of the Hebrew Scriptures, entering into the world. And here's this boy, the son of a widow, so she's already lost her husband, and now she's losing her only son. And this boy is prey in the very jaws of the grave, and Jesus snatches him back. And he takes him back as the King of life. Never invite Jesus to a funeral. He'll ruin it. He'll ruin the funeral. Like, funerals, cancel, God. Everybody, mourners, grievers, go home. You know, the grave diggers are still going to have to fill in the hole. But it's going to be an empty hole. Like, he ruins the funeral. So death is more tragic than we admit. Next thought is, Jesus' compassion runs deeper than we realize. His compassion runs deeper than we realize. You know, the funeral procession was there, but as anyone who's experienced grief, eventually, although everyone is so kind and they're there with the casseroles and they're there with the flowers and they're there with the cards and the Facebook comments and the texts and the warm meals, eventually those people all leave. And this widow would have been alone. And in the ancient world, in the Jewish world, in the Roman world, to be a widow, you would be utterly destitute. You would just be in a world of danger, in a world of hurt. And how does Jesus respond when he sees her? So remember, the two crowds, these two crowds are about to collide. I just think it's such an epic scene. It's like a battle of life and death, right? And the crowd of life and the crowd of death, they come and they collide. But Jesus, it says that he sees her, and his heart went out to her, the NIV says, but all the other translations render it more accurately. It says he was moved with compassion. When you think about God, do you think about a God of compassion? You know, Jesus has a lot of emotions in the Gospels. You know, he has joy. There's moments where he is just overjoyed, just stoked, glad, jubilation. There's moments of gratitude. There's moments of exhaustion where Jesus is tired. There's moments of deep sorrow, anxiety, anguish. And there's moments of anger where he's angry at the injustice of the world. But want to know what the number one emotion Jesus feels? Compassion. More than any other emotion in the Gospels, Jesus has compassion. 14 times in the Gospels, the word of compassion is either used by Jesus or of Jesus. Want to know the number one thing God feels to you according to the Gospels? Compassion. Do you think about that? That's how Jesus feels about you? He feels deep compassion. And the Greek word is super fascinating because it actually means to have a pit in your stomach. It's when you see someone you love hurting, you see someone you love in agony, you know, maybe you hear that word of tragedy or grief, and you just have that pit in your stomach. Jesus, he sees people in pain. He sees people suffering. He sees people lost in their sins. He says they're like sheep without a shepherd. And when he sees people sinning and confused and lost, his primary response is what? Compassion. He's moved with compassion. Now, a lot of us think, well, that's great. That's nice about the New Testament God, but what about this Old Testament God? He's a real problem, isn't he? He's a real jerk. He's a real bully. You know, I don't see that in the Old Testament. You could not be more wrong. Jesus is the culmination, the fulfillment, the embodiment of the Hebrew God. And I'll show you how this is the case. I could show you so many examples. Jesus, maybe it ratchet up to 8K high definition, ultra high resolution, or better yet, he's God IRL. He's in real life. But he is just the culmination of everything the Old Testament's been laying out. I'll just show you one passage. This is from Exodus. Do not mistreat or oppress a foreigner, for you were foreigners in Egypt. Could probably say a lot there about how God always loved the Gentiles, that God has no tolerance for racism. But we'll go on. Do not take advantage of the widow or the fatherless. If you do and they cry out to me, I will certainly hear their cry. My anger will be aroused. And he gets angry at injustice, right? I will kill you with the sword. Your wives will become widows. Your children will be fatherless. He's like, I'm going to take you out if you are messing with the vulnerable, if you're oppressing the marginalized. If you lend money to one of my people who's a needy, don't treat it like a business deal. Don't charge any interest. If you take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge, return it by sunset. Because the cloak, it's their only covering. It's his blanket. What else can he sleep in? And then I just love this line so much. When they cry out to me, I will hear, for I am compassionate. The whole story of the Exodus is a story of compassion. God hears their cry. They're oppressed. They're in bondage. They're in slavery. There's a genocide being perpetrated against them. And it says God heard the cry of the Israelites. He hears their cry. And I love this idea of like there's a guy, somebody, your cloak was like your most expensive item you owned a lot of the time, and you could take it, as surety or whatever. And he's like, hey, if you don't give it back to him at sunset and he's cold at night, I'm going to hear him crying. That's how compassionate God is. And he's compassionate for the widows and the fatherless. And this is just one scripture. I could show you dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of passages like this in the Old Testament. And Jesus is just this Old Testament God with skin on. He's God in the flesh. He's God become a human being. And he sees this widow burying her son, carrying him in a wicker basket, and he's wrenched in his guts. He's moved with compassion. My vision for counterculture is that counterculture could grow into a movement of people who are marked by the compassion of God. My desire for counterculture is that this church would grow, that this church would explode, that you would invite your friends, that it'd take off. But for what purpose? For what purpose? Because I would like it that we could rise up and be the church that's partnering with the school system. That we're finding the single mothers and we're providing mentoring. That we'd be the kind of church where people rise up and we foster and adopt kids. That we'd be the kind of church that we'd rise up and we'd find the broken places in Portland where the system is failing, where the system is breaking down, and we'd fill in those places. That's why I want counterculture to grow. That's why I want counterculture to take off, because I see a movement of people who are marked by the compassion of God. And that's not something I'm going to do even through my own, strength. It's people are going to rise up. There's going to be individuals who rise up and fill in those gaps, and I'll just be fanning the flames, just turning you loose to love our city. But we're not waiting for one day to do that. We're trying to start that 2 days. So I'll just give you, I don't know if you can scroll down to the announcements section, but I want to, Becca's going to do announcements at the end, but we got the Homeless Serve Day coming up on May 25th, and I do have grand dreams of us doing big things and starting new initiatives, but I don't just, we can't just have grand ideas for one day. We need to do something today. And so May 25th, we're going to be partnering with one of our partners that does houseless and recovery ministry, and I want to invite you to be there. Invite you to come out with us on May 25th. We've done it a few times, and it's a beautiful time to interact with people who are on the margins and who are vulnerable, and to invest in them. But there's more about the compassion of Jesus to say, and that's just particularly about how women were treated, in the ancient world, and obviously throughout history there's been sustained injustices. But I mean, I think we don't realize how bad it was in the ancient world. It's pretty wild. We got another quote to put up on the screen. But Plutarch said that Roman men kept their wives under lock and key. The rabbis, this wasn't in the Bible, this was just rabbinical writings. The rabbis said, "He who talks with a woman in public brings evil on himself. One should not even greet a woman. Let the law be burned than the law ever be taught to a woman." That's how the rabbis thought. The Romans were worse. You think that's bad? The Romans were worse. They had something called patria potestas. Patria potestas, okay? Patria potestas means the power of the patriarch. The power of the patriarch. Caesar Augustus ratified what was just a Roman tradition. He ratified it into law. Want to know what patria potestas meant? It meant the patriarch, the man of the household, he had the right to execute his wife and children, no questions asked. He could literally, you're dishonoring me, you're dishonoring my gravitas, you're done with. No questions asked. But guess what? As Christianity spread, because of the way Jesus interacted with women, and because of the way Paul said, husbands, don't kill your wives, die for your wives. That's what Paul writes. Because of that, as Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire, and eventually they were a persecuted minority, but it spread like wildfire, and eventually as it overtook the empire, want to know what Christians did? They absolutely abolished patria potestas in 374. Can we put our hands together for that? I mean, if that's not something to be excited about, I don't know what is. Like they abolished patria potestas, and the world's never been the same. You know, we're still living in the benefit and the legacy of the way the influence of Christ changed the ancient world. In the Gospels, Jesus never speaks a single harsh word to a woman. He speaks, he can get a little rough with the 12 disciples. He's like, you fools, like, what are you thinking, guys? He says some things to the religious elites that will singe your eyebrows when you read them. Like, he says things that are so fiery, so intense to the Pharisees, like you wouldn't believe it. But he never says a single harsh word to a woman in all the Gospels. And I think he knew that women had it harsh enough. I think he knew that there was enough of that. He corrects thinking, but he speaks in just utter gentleness to every single woman that he encounters in the New Testament. My mom always liked to point out, and Mom, if you're watching this, I love you. My mom always liked to point out that the first witnesses of the resurrection were women. And what's actually extraordinary about that is this. That is actually one of the greatest evidences that we're not just reading some myth somebody wrote up, that we're not just reading some fiction, that we're not just reading some propaganda that was like a ploy to try to get power and rally people to their cause. Want to know why? Well, we already said you couldn't even greet a woman in Jewish society. Women could not testify in a court case. This is horrible, but like women, their word counted for nothing. It was like dirt. So let me get this. So you're making up a fake story about a guy rising from the dead, trying to trick everyone and convince everyone, and you're going to go, I know who's going to be the witness to it. Women. It's like, that wouldn't make any sense. Celsus, actually a skeptic later on as Christianity took off, want to know what he did to mock and ridicule Christianity, trying to turn people back to Roman paganism? Celsus said, Christianity is nothing but the idle tales of women. But how cool is it from our perspective that now the fact that women, and that's called counterproductive narrative, it's called embarrassing narrative, and even the most secular scholars point out, no, that must have just happened. Like these women must have thought they saw Jesus. The disciples must have thought they saw Jesus, because there's no benefit to making that up. There's no benefit to making any of it up. And I can't get into it now, but there's something called the minimal facts approach, which is a case for the resurrection of Jesus. And it's where you only rely on facts that are agreed upon by secular scholars. And then you interpret those facts and go, hey, what's the most logical explanation? It's that he actually rose. And history was never the same after it. All right, so that brings us to our last point, and that's that the resurrection matters more than we know. The resurrection matters more than we know. So we'll just go through them real quick. Death is more tragic than we admit. Jesus' compassion runs deeper than we realize. And the resurrection matters more than we know. So he raises the boy to life. This guy gets up talking. I wonder what he says. He's like, holy cannoli. He sits up. Oh my God. I don't know. This is where my crazy mind goes. But he resurrects. Everybody's just blown away. Somebody get this guy a sandwich. But it says, in verse 16, a great prophet has appeared among us, and God has come to help his people. There's a story in the Old Testament kind of similar to this one, where there's Elijah the prophet. And Elijah the prophet, he is with a widow, he resurrects him. But want to know what's different in Elijah's story? For hours or an hour, he has to cry out to God and weep and cry out and stretch himself out over the boy and cry out and ask God to resurrect him. And then eventually this kid rises from the dead in the Old Testament. But what's interesting here's the question. Is Jesus a prophet, or has God come to help his people? Well, you tell me. Jesus didn't cry out to anyone. Jesus didn't weep. All Jesus does, he says, wake up. He's the God who made life. He's more than a prophet. He doesn't have to pray to anybody. He just says a word, and this boy is resurrected. He's God IRL. Now, in Portland, the compassion of Jesus resonates with us. But I just am kind of warning you here. A day's going to come where you're going to show up to Counterculture, and I'm going to be reading the Bible, and I'm going to be teaching the Bible, and I'm going to say something that doesn't resonate in Portland. just be forewarned, okay? And some of us, we go, yeah, I'm kind of interested in this Jesus thing. I kind of like some of this. I like that he's compassionate. I like that they abolished patria potestas. I like that. But then there are certain controversial issues. There are certain debates. There are certain topics that we go, I don't like that. I don't know if I can believe in Jesus, if he says something that doesn't jive with me, that offends me, that goes against the grain of kind of what's in vogue, of the zeitgeist of the day, of what our culture believes. I don't like that. But let me ask you this. Suppose Jesus really did rise from the dead. Suppose God really exists. Must he also always agree with us? Does he have to always take our view? Do we want to see a transcendent king of the universe, or do we want to look into a mirror? Do we need a God who just looks like us and talks like us and thinks like us and does like us? What's even the point? Why even worship him at all? I want a God who can challenge me. I want a God who's outside of time. If there ever comes a point where me and God disagree, I'm the one who needs to change my opinion. I'm the one who needs to change my perspective. So, obviously we will talk sensitively and with nuance and with compassion on all variety of topics. But I just want to say this. Before you ask, does the Bible agree with me? Does the Bible say this about this opinion, this topic? Does Christianity teach this? And is it going to align with me, or is it going to offend me? Don't ask any of those questions. Simply ask this. Is it true? Is it true? Look into that minimal facts approach thing I'm talking about. Look at the evidence for the resurrection. And if Jesus really is the Lord of life and death, do whatever he says. Then fall to your knees and bow at his feet. That's the only sensible thing to do. But if it's not true, then just get out of here. Don't waste your time. Don't even sleep in. Go to brunch. If it's not true, but that's how confident I feel about, looking into it. And I think you'll find it's pretty compelling stuff. Okay, so somebody could be sitting here and going, okay, I see your point there. If he did rise, we should probably listen to what he says. But that's all this resurrection stuff. Okay, great. So Jesus rose, one day we're going to rise. There's going to be a new creation. There's going to be a new heavens and new earth. Like death's not the end. You know, we're going to see our loved ones again. That all sounds very nice. But what about the here and now, Jesse? What about the problems in our world? What about the injustice in our city? What about the difficult things around us? What good does some afterlife do for this life? That's nice that you're talking that there's going to be a new world one day. But what about this world? What does it do for the here and the now? Well, let me tell you. In the 3rd century under Marcus Aurelius, a plague far worse, and COVID was horrible, don't misunderstand me, but a plague far worse than COVID broke out. And I'll spare you too much of the gruesome details, but let me just tell you, it was horrifying. Some people think it might have been similar to like smallpox, but here's the bottom line. 1/3 of the Roman Empire, 1/3 of Rome died due to this plague. There was just death everywhere, absolute pandemonium, absolute chaos, absolute despair everywhere you looked. And but one historian writes this, Cyprian, he writes about this. He says, in contrast to the prevailing despair, Christians seemed to carry their dead as in triumph. Wow. Carried the dead as in triumph. But it gets better than that. And it's just, okay, well, great. They are triumphant. Maybe they're out of touch with reality. No, it gets better. The historians write that under the plague of Cyprian, people were so afraid of catching the plague, they were abandoning their loved ones in the streets. They were fleeing the city of Rome. They were doing anything they could, trampling over each other just to get out of there and not get infected. But when everybody was fleeing the city, including Galen, by the way, if you ever learn about Galen, he lived through this. You learn about it in a medical text. He discovered antiseptic. It's actually written that Galen fled the city of Rome. He was a doctor, but he didn't stay to care for people. But want to know what historians write? When everybody was fleeing the city of Rome, these Christians who carried their dead as in triumph, want to know what they did? They ran into the city of Rome. And they nursed people, and they cared for people. And they gave just simple things like food and water and blankets and just doing anything they could to help these sick people. And the historians write that sometimes the Christian would nurse someone, and the person would get better, and the Christian would die. See, this is the difference that the resurrection makes. This is the difference that the compassion of Jesus makes. It says in verse 13, when he saw her, he was moved with compassion, and he said, "Do not weep." But you know what's interesting? In other situations, Jesus weeps. And as the band comes back up on stage, and we close this service out, Jesus weeps. And what is offered to us in the gospel is this. In order to wipe our tears, Jesus shed tears. In order to take away our sorrows, Jesus became a man of sorrows. That he came and entered into our brokenness, entered into our pain, so that one day he could take it away. And, most of you know, and I try not to, make everything about what I'm going through, because you're going through things. Your life has issues. You're battling things. But I've been going through one of the most difficult times of my life. And I stumbled upon this Scottish hymn this week, and I just want to close the service with this, because it really ministered to me, and maybe it'll minister to you. You know, and maybe you're not dealing with a death this week. Maybe it's just a hard time at your job, or it's a relationship that broke down, or it's just strife or tension, or maybe it's a chronic health issue, or maybe it's psychological, or just anything you're going through this week. I want you to just pay attention to this Scottish hymn. Our fellow sufferer yet retains a fellow feeling of our pains. He still remembers in the sky his tears, his agonies and cries. In every pang that rends the heart, the man of sorrows had a part. He sympathizes with our grief, and to the sufferer sends relief. Jesus is the empathy of God. He entered into our suffering. We're going to take communion, and that's a symbol of Jesus' blood that was poured out on the cross. It's a symbol of his body that was broken. We're going to have the prayer team available on the sides. And the cool thing is we're called the body of Christ. We're meant to express that empathy to one another. We're meant to express that mutual love and understanding to each other. So I'll have the prayer team available, and let's stand and worship.